Hi, and welcome back. We're going to continue discussing the history of spiritual thinking and the various groups from antiquity. But today I wanted to speak about heresy and orthodoxy and why it is that Christianity is or appears to be so strong in their belief system and seems to believe that everyone else is false or inferior. And we're going to see that this was a process that happened in early Christianity. We've already discussed a number of the different groups who were Christian during the first, second, and third century and looked at some of their writings, and I will continue to do so. We've seen remarkable diversity among the Christian groups, and we will continue to see that as we go through the centuries. Of course, I'm not going to spend all of the time speaking about Christian groups because there are a number of other religions that were making progress at the same time, and not one of them lived in a bubble. There is always intercommunication and influence from one group to another, and it's interesting to see if we can find signs of that. Now, each of the groups that I've spoken about so far, and the ones we'll see in the future, had authoritative books that they claimed to represent the views of Jesus and the apostles. Remember, the Ebionites used the Gospel of Matthew, and the Marcionites apparently used Luke, and the followers of Valentinus preferred the Gospel of John. There was only one of the early Christian groups that emerged as victorious in the struggle to win converts, and a group that shaped for all time what Christians would believe and what scriptures they would accept. How, though, did this one group establish itself as dominant? Well, that's an interesting thing to trace through the first few centuries. Now, Eusebius was a 4th century father of the church. He's one of the most important authors in Christian church history. He wrote an ecclesiastical history. It was a book written in 10 volumes, and it is still available for reading today. The book discusses a number of topics, including how Christianity spread, the rise of different important churches, the opposition of the Jewish authorities and the persecution by the Roman government, and the significant early Christian leaders and writers. We owe our knowledge to the numerous Christian writings to Eusebius because he quotes them in length and they otherwise would have been lost, because you'll see that once there was a dominant and victorious Orthodox Christian group, they destroyed as much of the writings of the other groups as they possibly could. Some of them, like the Ebionites, we have no original writings. All we have are quotes from their critics. And so his writing is very important. His theory was that orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church, is and always has been the true view that was advocated by Jesus and his followers. And heresy, or the heretics, was always a corruption of the truth. It was always a minority fringe movement, and it was later than the teachings of the true church. It was derivative, it was a corrupt minority. And this classical view of the relationship between orthodoxy and heresy was held for about 16 centuries, and then there was a change. Now, before I speak more specifically about this change in the way we view early Christian history, I want to talk about those two words that we throw around, heresy and orthodoxy, and what they mean. Orthodox, to be orthodox, means right thinking. If you are considering yourself orthodox, it means that you believe what you think about your faith and your scriptures, the scriptures you have. You believe they're the right ones. You have the right doctrine, the right interpretation, the correct writings. You are right thinking. Heresy means choice. Heresy means that you're thinking about these things in a different way. And when we hear the word heresy today, we have a tendency to think that it's evil. These people are evil, they're destructive, they're out to get the Orthodox. But in fact, what it means is they think differently, they believe differently, they are sincere believers. And everyone tends to think of whatever they believe as the correct one and the other people as the heretics. And so it's probably in our modern world a good idea to realize that there is diversity in spiritual thought. And often we find, as we think about these things, that our points of view change. And what at one point we thought was orthodox, we might someday think is heretical. It just means a different choice. So the change in which we think about early Christian groups and orthodoxy and heresy didn't come until modern times, with the discovery of some of these Christian writings and a more critical look at what Eusebius was saying based upon these new discoveries. In 1934, there was a book written by Walter Bauer. It was called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. And he took a good look at what Eusebius said. And he thought that rather being the original views of the majority of Christians being those that ended up to be Orthodox, that orthodoxy was just one of numerous forms of Christianity in the early centuries. It ended up being the one that acquired the majority of converts over time. But the earliest forms of Christianity were, in fact, the non-Orthodox, for example, the Gnostics and the Marcionites. And although he did not discuss Ebionites, Ebionites are one of the earliest Christian groups. Now, there were, of course, pockets of believers who held the views that later become dominant. We call those the proto-Orthodox views, but they were not the majority everywhere. In a number of places, other groups were in the majority, but they were the majority in the city of Rome. And that ended up being very significant because Rome, and this group located there, is the capital of the empire. So it was able to use vast resources and administrative skill to exert influence on churches in the surrounding area and around the known world. So by the beginning of the 4th century, it's the Roman form of Christianity that was dominant, with the Roman Church determining the future course of Christianity. Now, today, it's 70 years since Bauer wrote his book, and no one subscribes to everything that he wrote therein, but his basic understanding of how Christianity began is very influential. And since his writing, we've discovered the Nag Hammadi Library, and it appears from these early Christian writings, a number of which we're going through in our studies here, that early Christianity was widely diverse. In fact, if you read the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, in almost all of his letters, is being opposed by some other Christian group who's believing differently than he is. And each of these groups appears to have had its own literature, books allegedly written by the apostles, um, who uh, who are writing to give authority to this particular point of view. And we'll see that the production and the spreading of literature was extremely important in the struggle between these different groups. Christians came to believe that they needed authoritative writings on which to base their faith. It would take centuries for these writings to be discussed and finally determined. In fact, it wasn't until the year 367 that Athanasius finally suggested the 27 books that we currently have in our New Testament. Well, it was agreed upon, of course, that the words of Jesus, anything that could be found that Jesus said, would be considered authentic and scripture. And also the words of Paul, who was actually the first writer. Some of his letters are the very first Christian writings, were quickly accepted as authentic and probably should be in the canon of scripture. There were several kinds of writings, though, that circulated during the early Christian years. And the first kind, of course, was genuine. At least some of the letters that Paul wrote that we have in the New Testament are considered genuine writings of his. There are 13 altogether. 6 of them are disputed by scholars today that perhaps they were written by a disciple of Paul and are not original to him. But there are some authentic and genuine writings in the New Testament. The second kind of writing were things that were written anonymously. And then the example that we have for this is primarily the 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were assigned those names at a later time. The Gospels were originally written anonymously. Legend was basis for assigning them names at a later time. The legends that grew up about these various gospels. Now, another kind of writing is called pseudonymous, and a number of the texts that we've been studying together are pseudonymous writings. That means that we don't really know who wrote them, but they were written in the name of someone who was well known. In other words, they're forgeries. But there were many of these writings, and some of the ones we've discussed so far are the Apocalypse of Paul and the Apocalypse of Abraham. And it's unsure about, for example, the Gospel of Thomas. Now, some of these writings obviously did not make it into the canon of Scripture, and some of them are obviously pseudonymous, but some of them are questionably so. And that was a very unique but popular kind of writing. By writing in the name of someone well known or someone well known and ancient, authority was given to a writing by someone who was pretty much unknown or didn't have enough authority to have people listen to their words. So they've decided to use the name of someone who does have a bit more punch behind the name. So those are the kinds of things that were circulating, and it's going to be a long time of discussion, ironing out what the doctrine of the church will actually be, what people should believe, and what writings will be acceptable. Well, it was the proto-Orthodox Christians who eventually decided the books in the New Testament, which ones to include in the canon, and they had some criteria. The book had to be ancient. It had to have been written in the first or the beginning of the second century. Nothing written very long after the time of Jesus would be accepted. A book needed to be apostolic, that is, written by an apostle or one of his companions. It needed to be orthodox. In other words, it needed to agree with the doctrines that the church in Rome decided were the orthodox teachings. And it had to be widely recognized throughout the church. In other words, it was a book that had been circulated now for 3 centuries around the church and was well known. And using these criteria, the proto-Orthodox Christians debated about which books should belong in the canon. And in the year 367, Athanasius had produced a list of 27 books, and these are the books that are currently in the canon of Scripture. So it was a long battle to see what would become Orthodox. And once Orthodoxy was established and the uh, the Orthodox interpretation of these scriptures was established, the canon was established, there was a concerted effort to rid the world of any heretical writings or heretical groups. Like all power struggles and stories thereof, the battle for orthodoxy in Christianity has a political side, and part of that will include the Emperor Constantine. But that part of the story is for another day. If you're really interested in the battles over authenticity of the New Testament. You might be interested in a course from the Great Courses, the teaching company. It's called Lost Christianities, Christian Scriptures and the Battles Over Authenticity. It's Professor Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a very well-known speaker, teacher, and writer about early Christian times and Christian people, doctrines, etc. A great historian. And this is available for download and also in DVD and possibly even CD formats. So I do recommend it, and some of the information that I shared with you today is from this course. I'll link the information below in the description of this video. Well, next time, we're going to move on again to another one of those groups or writings that were available at that time. It's interesting that as time went on, the church did not stop persecuting those that they considered heretics. And today, someone declared a heretic is ostracized by the church. But there were times when the church, the Christian church, used military force and governments of various countries to annihilate sects of Christians that disagreed with them, with orthodoxy, and were considered heretics. And we'll learn about some of those groups as well as we go along through the centuries of Christian or spiritual thought. So I want to thank you again for being here. I'm glad that I'm gathering together a group of people interested in the history of these things, and I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and also click the notification bell so you know when a new video comes out. I try to release every Saturday morning, and that's not written in stone. I'm only human, but I do my very best. And also, leave your comments, questions, and suggestions. I've received some interesting comments, and I learn new things from your comments all the time. So I hope you'll correspond with me and join me again next time for another look into ancient religious thought.